Dubai's darkest secret. A married man's affair leads to murder. True crime story. Hook. What happens when betrayal, power, and revenge collide? A young crew member is trapped in a dangerous game she never asked to play. Can she escape the Sheik's deadly plan before it's too late? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking twists and dark secrets that will leave you breathless. The luxury yacht drifted silently under the glowing moonlight. The distant hum of the engine echoed through the quiet night. On board, the atmosphere felt tense, electric. She could feel it in her chest. Tara, a young crew member, wiped down the polished railings. The salt air clung to her skin as she moved, each step calculated. She had been warned about him, the Sheik, but tonight felt different. The breeze shifted, cold and biting. She turned the corner, her breath catching in her throat. He was there, the Sheik, his eyes locked onto hers. "Join me," he said softly, a voice she could never refuse. The moonlight reflected off his dark, expensive suit. Tara hesitated, but it was too late. She found herself following him, down to the lower deck, where no one could see. The shadows swallowed them whole. The air smelled like leather and cologne. Everything was quiet, too quiet. He stepped closer. His hand brushed her arm. She felt her pulse quicken, but it wasn't just excitement. It was fear. A dark, gnawing sense of dread curled in her stomach. Something was wrong. "Relax," he whispered, but his words were heavy with a hidden meaning. Tara's eyes flickered to the nearby cabin door. It was cracked open. She almost missed it. A flash of something, a piece of paper slipping out from under. Her gaze snapped back to him. He caught the look. "Don't worry," he said, his voice too smooth. His lips hovered close to hers, just inches away. And then a phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Tara froze. He was looking at her phone. The message was clear, his words like ice. "You shouldn't have come here." Tara's breath caught in her throat. It was too late. The game had begun. She should have never been on this yacht. Not with him. Not with the secret he kept buried deep. Not with what she didn't know about him. His smile was cold, like a predator's. Tara's heart raced. She tried to back away, but he was too quick. His hand caught her wrist. "Tara," he said, his tone shifting, "do you know what you've walked into?" She could feel the weight of his words. His grip tightened, and she gasped. The air seemed to thicken around them. He pulled her closer, the scent of his cologne suffocating. "I gave you a choice," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Now you've sealed your fate." Tara struggled to free herself, but it was no use. Her mind raced. What had she stumbled into? What secret was he hiding? She glanced around again, hoping for an escape. But the cabin door was now shut. The yacht was far from land. A trap. Her blood ran cold. The Sheik's eyes darkened. "Do you think you're the first?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Tara blinked, confused. "First for what?" He leaned in, his lips almost touching her ear. "For betrayal," he whispered. His breath was hot against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. "Do you think I don't know what you did?" he continued. Tara's mind spun, trying to piece it together. Betrayal? Her eyes widened. The phone buzzed again. A message, this time not for her. He turned toward it, reading the screen, his face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Tara's confusion morphed into fear. He was hiding something darker than she'd imagined. Something dangerous, and she had just uncovered it. The truth was more horrifying than she could have ever predicted. Her skin crawled. She tried to pull away again, but the Sheik was already steps ahead. He was prepared. Her fate had already been sealed. The Sheik's eyes narrowed as he turned back to face her. "Do you think you can escape?" he said, his voice dripping with menace. Tara's chest tightened. The fear was suffocating now, all-consuming. The darkness of the lower deck seemed to close in, swallowing her whole. The quiet hum of the yacht felt deafening. His fingers brushed her cheek lightly, but there was nothing gentle in his touch. His smile had faded, replaced with something colder, more calculating. "You're in my world now," he murmured. Tara's breath was shallow. She couldn't think straight. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. He was watching her closely, sensing her panic. And then the world shifted. A door slammed open. The sudden noise felt like thunder. Tara's heart skipped. Two men entered the cabin. They wore dark suits, faces hidden in shadows. The sheik stepped back, his demeanor shifting again. Calm, controlled. "I believe it's time," he said, his words slow. One of the men moved toward Tara, his gaze cold and unfeeling. She backed up instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The door was blocked. The tension in the air grew thick. The sheik gave a slight nod. One of the men reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. He handed it to the sheik. The sheik took it, his fingers trembling slightly. Tara watched, confusion turning into dread. He tore the envelope open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His face twisted in something almost like disgust as he read it. "Seems you've been very busy," he said to Tara, his voice now tinged with something darker. Her mind raced. What had she done? What secret had she uncovered? He took a step toward her, his eyes now filled with fury. "You didn't think there would be no consequences, did you?" he hissed. Tara's stomach turned. She finally understood. She had walked into a game she was never meant to play. And now, there was no turning back. The sheik's hand trembled as he crumpled the paper, his eyes burning with rage. Tara's pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel the walls closing in on her, suffocating her. One of the men stepped forward, grabbing her arm with a grip that made her wince. She tried to pull away, but he was too strong. The sheik's voice cut through the air, low and menacing. "You think you're innocent in all this? Think again." Tara's mind raced, but her throat was dry. She couldn't form words, couldn't think clearly. The room felt smaller now, the shadows longer, darker. The second man stepped toward the table, placing a syringe down with a soft clink. Tara's breath caught. She knew what it was. Her body froze. "Please no," she whispered, barely able to speak. The sheik's smile was twisted, almost amused. "You have no idea how deep this goes, do you?" Her legs wobbled beneath her, fear crashing over her in waves. The first man held her firmly in place as the sheik slowly approached. The syringe glinted under the harsh light above them. Tara's skin crawled, every instinct telling her to run. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. "You will understand soon enough," the sheik said, his voice like ice. Tara's heart pounded louder in her chest. What had she stumbled into? What was this secret the sheik had hidden so carefully? The second man, calm and efficient, stepped closer with the syringe. Tara shook her head, frantic now. "No, please." The sheik raised a hand, silencing her. "This is your punishment," he said softly. His words were cold, unfeeling. Tara's world blurred as the needle pierced her skin. It was quick, sharp, like a jolt of electricity. But the sting didn't fade. It spread, and with it came the weight of realization. She hadn't just stumbled into a secret. She had been a pawn in a game much darker than she could have imagined. And now she was marked. The coldness in the sheik's eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about control. It was about revenge. And she had just become part of it. The room seemed to spin around Tara as the sharp sting of the needle pulsed through her veins. Her vision blurred. She couldn't focus. The world around her became distant, muffled. The sheik's eyes watched her closely, like a predator savoring his prey. The drug was taking hold, faster than she could fight it. She tried to step back, but her legs buckled beneath her. The second man caught her, holding her upright with ease. Tara's breath came in shallow gasps. Her heart pounded, wild and frantic. You're making a mistake," she whispered, her voice shaky. The sheik chuckled softly, a sound that chilled her to the bone. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice mocking. "No, my dear, this is not a mistake. This is justice." Tara's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what she had just witnessed. What justice? What was he talking about? The second man released her, stepping back as the sheik took a step forward. His face was inches from hers now. "You're not the first woman to be used," he said coldly. Tara's heart sank. "Used," she whispered, barely able to breathe. "You don't know the game you've walked into," the sheik continued, his voice colder than ice. "You're nothing but a tool, a pawn. And now you'll pay the price." Tara's body felt heavy, her thoughts disjointed. She was losing control, slipping in and out of consciousness. But the words kept coming. "You think you're special," the sheik sneered, "but you were never more than a means to an end." Her chest tightened with horror as she tried to grasp his words. A means to an end? She wasn't the one who had betrayed him, wasn't she? She couldn't understand. Her vision darkened, and everything around her seemed to blur into the shadows. She could hear the sheik's voice, distant now. "The virus, you'll spread it just like the others, just like she did." Tara's blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't fight it. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She was part of a cruel, twisted revenge scheme. And the worst part, it wasn't even her fault. But now there was no escape. And no one would ever believe her. Her body felt like it was sinking into the cold floor, heavy and unresponsive. The words echoed in her mind. "The virus, you'll spread it just like the others." Her heart raced, every beat pounding with terror. It was a trap, a lie, but it didn't feel like it. The sheik's words were cold, calculated. She could barely make sense of them, the drug clouding her thoughts. But the horror was clear. He was punishing her for something she didn't even fully understand. "You're nothing more than a part of the game," the sheik's voice dripped with disdain. Tara's vision was fading, the edges of the room growing dim. She could barely hold her head up. But as her eyes closed, the truth became painfully clear. She had been used. She had walked into this trap, a pawn in someone else's twisted scheme. And now she had become a weapon. Her limbs felt numb, but her mind raced with questions. Who was she? The woman the sheik had mentioned? Was she another victim? Another pawn? Tara wanted to scream, to fight, but her body betrayed her. The men moved around her, silent, efficient. The second man turned, his gaze never leaving her. He opened a small bag, revealing a vial of something. Tara's chest tightened. Her mind was foggy, but there was a gut-wrenching feeling that told her it was something worse than she could imagine. The sheik stepped closer, looming over her. "You'll learn, Tara. You'll learn what happens when you try to betray me." Her thoughts scattered. Betray? She hadn't betrayed anyone, hadn't done anything wrong. But the truth didn't matter anymore. The sheik's plan was already set in motion, and she was caught in the middle of it. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and for the first time, she saw his face without the smirk. It was something darker now, determined, something that made her blood run colder than the night air. She was no longer just a crew member. She was part of something far worse. The men moved swiftly, one of them securing her arms. The syringe gleamed once again, its cold steel a reminder of what she had become. "You're a lesson," the sheik said. A warning. Her mind screamed. But the drug in her system pulled her back into the void. She had no idea how deep the game went. No idea how far the sheik would take it. But she had just crossed a point of no return. The darkness was swallowing her whole, pulling her deeper with every passing second. Her limbs felt like they were made of stone. She couldn't move, couldn't fight, The sheik's voice echoed, distant and ominous. A lesson, he had said. A warning. Tara's head spun. Her vision flickered. Everything around her was fading. She tried to focus, to make sense of it. But the weight of the drug, the betrayal, crushed her. She could hear their footsteps moving around her, like shadows in the night. One of the men approached her again. His hand gripped her chin, forcing her to look up. "Stay with us," he murmured, his voice cold. The syringe gleamed in his hand, drawing her eyes to it, drawing her into the nightmare. Her breath quickened despite the fog in her head. She tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was closing up. The man hovered over her, his cold eyes locked onto hers. But then, something changed. The sheik's voice cut through the haze, sharper now. "Enough." The man froze. Tara blinked, struggling to stay conscious, to hold onto any sliver of reality. The sheik stepped forward, his eyes colder than before. "She's not ready yet," he said, almost as if talking to himself. Tara's heart hammered in her chest. What was he talking about? What did he mean, not ready? Her mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. But through the fog, she could still hear the faint sound of waves crashing against the yacht. It was the only thing that felt real. The sheik's cold gaze locked onto hers again. "This is where you learn, Tara, where you truly understand what you're up against." She barely managed to hold her head up, her vision swimming. "What are you talking about?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The sheik's lips curled into a cruel smile. "It's simple. You will spread this. Spread the consequences of your choices." Tara's blood ran cold. Spread? She couldn't comprehend it. She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. Her body was fighting her, and every thought was slipping away faster than she could grab hold of it. Suddenly, the man holding her chin released her, stepping back. The room seemed to grow colder. Tara's body trembled, a new kind of terror clawing at her. She wasn't just a pawn in a game. She was being used as a weapon. And the worst part, she had no choice but to play along. The sheik's laugh echoed in the cold air. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Tara could only hear the faint sound of her own breath, shaky and shallow. A new terror settled in her chest. She had no idea how long this would last, how much further he was willing to take it. The silence stretched, suffocating and thick. Tara could barely keep her eyes open now, the weight of the drug clouding her mind even further. The sheik's presence felt like a heavy shadow over her. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her body was numb. She could no longer control the fear flooding her veins. It spread like ice. She had to escape, but her body refused to respond. The men moved around her, speaking in hushed tones. Tara couldn't understand what they were saying. The words blurred together. But it didn't matter. She could feel their eyes on her, like vultures waiting for the right moment to strike. The sheik's cold voice broke through the haze once again. "You have no idea how deep this goes, do you?" Her eyes fluttered open, barely able to focus. She tried to speak, but couldn't find the strength. The sheik stepped closer, his dark eyes reflecting something sinister. "You think you're a victim," he said, the words like daggers. "But you're not. You're just like the others." Tara's chest tightened. The others? Who was he talking about? She wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't piece it all together, couldn't make sense of the nightmare she was trapped in. The sheik's cold smile twisted further. This is how it always begins. The betrayal, the game, the end. Her heart skipped a beat. Betrayal? The word echoed in her mind. Tara's thoughts scattered like shards of glass. She was being punished for something. But what? She wasn't part of any scheme. She hadn't betrayed him, had she? Her head throbbed with unanswered questions. But the answers never came. The men watched her closely, their faces unreadable. And then the sheik turned away, his steps echoing as he walked toward the door. "I'll be back," he said, his voice cold. "When you're ready to understand." The door slammed behind him, and in that moment, Tara was alone in the darkness, still caught in the web of his game. Her body ached, her mind screamed for release, but all she could do was wait for the next move, wait for the consequences. And in the pit of her stomach, the most terrifying thought of all bloomed. She might never escape. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed in the empty room. Tara was left in darkness, the silence pressing in on her like a suffocating weight. Her mind was spinning, a cyclone of confusion and fear. She could barely keep her eyes open, but the lingering presence of the men of the Sheik still filled the room. The drug in her system kept her tethered to the nightmare, unable to break free, unable to think clearly. Her body felt alien, distant, as though it wasn't hers to control anymore. She tried to push herself up, to sit, but her limbs refused to cooperate. Every movement felt like a battle. Her breath came in ragged gasps. What had he meant by "when you're ready to understand"? What was happening to her? Tara's mind was still foggy, but one thing was clear. She was trapped. The walls of the yacht felt like they were closing in, the stifling air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. She fought the urge to close her eyes and slip back into the void, but it was so tempting, so easy. Suddenly, she heard footsteps again, soft, steady. Her heart skipped, her body tensing instinctively. The door creaked open, just a crack. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. It wasn't the Sheik. One of the men, the one who had been with him earlier, stepped inside. Tara couldn't move, couldn't speak. He closed the door behind him, his face unreadable. He walked toward her, his footsteps almost inaudible on the polished floor. He didn't speak at first, just stood there watching her. Tara could barely focus on his face. But then he spoke, his voice low. "Don't fight it." She blinked, the words slowly sinking in. "Don't fight it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His eyes softened for just a second, but there was no warmth in them, only a cold, calculating detachment. "It's already done," he said, his voice almost like a warning. Tara's breath hitched. She could barely comprehend what he was saying, but the dread began to creep in again, the unsettling feeling that things were slipping out of her control. "What do you mean?" "What's done?" she managed to croak, her throat dry, her voice hoarse. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're a part of the plan now," he said, "and there's no going back." The words struck her like a hammer to the chest. The plan, the virus. Her mind recoiled at the thought, but it was too late to deny it. She had been marked. She was a pawn in something much darker than she ever imagined. Her body trembled uncontrollably, the fear crawling under her skin. "You're going to learn what happens when you betray him," the man added, his tone colder than ever. "When you try to run." Tara's eyes widened in terror, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. But it was too much, too overwhelming. Everything was spiraling out of control. And then, as if to drive the point home, the man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small vial. The same vial she had seen earlier. It glinted in the dim light. Tara's stomach lurched. "No, please," she whispered, almost begging, though she knew it wouldn't matter. He moved forward with a steady hand, and she could do nothing but watch. Her heart hammered, and a cold sweat broke out over her skin. The man didn't hesitate, and neither did she. This was it. The moment everything changed, the man moved with a slow, deliberate calm, his eyes never leaving hers. Tara's breath came faster, her mind fighting to stay coherent. But everything was spinning. She couldn't stop him. She couldn't stop any of them. The vial in his hand seemed to glow in the dim light, mocking her helplessness. He opened it with a quick snap, the sound sharp and final. Tara's heart raced, every instinct screaming at her to run. but her body betrayed her, paralyzed by fear and the drug still coursing through her veins. The man stepped closer, his movements measured. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. "I don't know what you want from me." His cold eyes softened for the briefest moment, but there was no mercy in them. "You've already become part of this," he said quietly. "And now you'll understand what that truly means." Tara couldn't think. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. She couldn't process what was happening. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? As the man brought the vial closer to her, she tried to pull away, but the world around her seemed to fade, her muscles betraying her, unresponsive. The man's hand hovered near her face, and with a steady hand, he tipped the vial, letting its contents spill onto a small piece of cloth he had taken from his pocket. The smell was sharp, acrid, something she couldn't identify. Her skin prickled as the cloth came near her mouth, and before she could react, he pressed it to her nose. A sharp, bitter sting filled her senses, and her world went black. She tried to scream, but the sound was lost as everything around her faded to darkness. The last thing she felt before losing consciousness was the coldness of his hand against her cheek, the only connection to the reality that was slipping away. When she awoke, she was somewhere different. The air smelled sterile, clean. Her body felt heavy. She was lying on a cold metal surface, the harsh light above her, making everything feel surreal. Her head throbbed, her body aching with every tiny movement. Tara's eyes fluttered open, and the world came back to her in pieces. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. She turned her head weakly, trying to make sense of where she was. A door creaked open. Her body stiffened, panic rising in her chest. But it wasn't him. It wasn't the Sheik. A woman stepped into the room. Her face was familiar, though Tara couldn't place her immediately. The woman looked at her with eyes full of something: sympathy? Pity? Tara couldn't tell. "You're awake," the woman said quietly, her voice soft but steady. Tara tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her words catching. The woman moved closer, her expression somber. "Don't try to talk just yet," she said. "You need to rest. Rest." Tara's mind swirled. Rest. After everything that had happened, she couldn't relax. Not now. Not after everything. Her hand shot out, gripping the edge of the metal table. What's going on? Where am I?" The woman sighed, sitting down beside her. "You're safe. For now." Tara's pulse raced. "Safe," she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering with something Tara couldn't quite read. "I'm here to help you," she said, her voice tinged with an edge of urgency. Help. Tara's mind was still too clouded to understand, but as the woman looked at her, Tara caught a glimmer of something that made her blood run cold. Fear. And for the first time since she'd awoken, Tara realized she wasn't safe. Not at all. This was far from over. The woman's eyes flickered with something darker, something hidden beneath her calm exterior. Tara's heart began to pound in her chest again, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. She tried to sit up, her body still weak, but her mind was racing. "I need to know what's going on," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. The woman didn't answer immediately. She just watched Tara for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Tara's breath caught as the silence dragged on. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low. "It's not just the Sheik you have to worry about now." Tara's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" she whispered, struggling to keep her voice steady. The woman leaned in slightly, her eyes darkening. "The Sheik is just the beginning. The real danger lies in what they've made you a part of." Tara's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, but the weight of the truth still eluded her. What have they made me a part of?" she asked, barely able to breathe. The woman hesitated again, her gaze shifting as if she were unsure how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're using you to spread it." "Spread what?" Tara's voice cracked. The woman sighed, sitting back, her hands shaking slightly. "The virus. The same one that's been infecting the others. The one that's been tearing through the Sheik's enemies for years." Tara's stomach turned. She had heard whispers, rumors among the crew, but she had never truly understood what they were talking about. But now it was clear. Her chest constricted as she realized the magnitude of it all. "They injected me," Tara whispered, her mind reeling. "They used me as a weapon?" The woman nodded, her face grim. "Exactly." Tara's eyes blurred with tears, but she fought them back. "I didn't choose this," she choked out. "No," the woman replied, "but they don't care about that. You're just another pawn in their game. The Sheik wants to make sure you suffer, just like the others." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of something horrific. The weight of it all made her head spin. "But I don't even understand," Tara said, struggling to keep her composure. "Why me? Why did they choose me?" The woman's face softened, a hint of empathy in her eyes. "Because you were close. You were vulnerable, and they knew that you'd have access to those who could help them complete their plan." Tara's pulse quickened as the pieces fell into place. The yacht, the crew, everything she had once thought was just a dream job. It had all been part of their strategy. How do I stop this?" Tara asked, her voice barely audible. The woman's gaze flickered to the door behind her, as if checking to make sure they were still alone. "You can't," she whispered. "Not unless you want to become part of it. Become like them." Tara's blood ran cold. The thought of being a part of this, of becoming an instrument of the Sheik's cruelty, made her stomach churn. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't." The woman looked at her with a mixture of pity and regret. "There's a way out," she said quietly, "but it's dangerous, and you might not make it out alive." Tara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She wasn't sure what the woman meant, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself become the weapon they wanted her to be. "I'll do whatever it takes," Tara said, her voice shaking with the weight of her decision. The woman's eyes searched hers for a long moment, as if gauging her resolve. "Then we need to act fast," she said finally, "before they come back for you." Tara nodded, her heart hammering. She didn't know what the woman had planned, but she knew one thing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and if she had to fight for her life, she would. No matter what it took to. Tara's mind raced as the woman spoke, the words barely sinking in. "Before they come back for you," the woman repeated, her voice tight with urgency. Tara nodded slowly, though she had no idea what the woman meant by act fast. She didn't know how much time she had left, how much time they had before the Sheik would realize she was awake, before he could find her again. "Who are you?" Tara asked, her voice hoarse, her eyes scanning the woman's face for any hint of truth. The woman's gaze hardened for a moment, but she didn't pull away. "I used to work for him," she said quietly. "The Sheik. He's not what you think. He's worse." Tara's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The woman took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as if considering her words carefully. "He's not just a man of wealth and power. He's a man of revenge. This whole thing, the virus, the manipulation, the lies, it's all part of a game to him. He wants control, and anyone who stands in his way is either crushed or infected." Tara could hardly process the words, but the cold, relentless truth was beginning to settle in. "So, what's this plan you're talking about?" she asked, trying to focus, her voice rising with frustration. The woman moved closer, her eyes darting to the door once again. "It's simple," she said, her voice urgent but low. "We destroy the source. The virus. It's inside you, but it can't spread unless it's activated. If we find the antidote, there's a way to neutralize it before it takes full control. Tara felt a surge of hope, a spark in the deep dark pit where dread had settled. The antidote, she whispered. Where is it? The woman glanced toward the door, her face filled with fear. We need to move now, before they notice we're gone. I'll explain everything, but we don't have much time. Once they realize what you've learned, they won't stop until they find you again. Tara stood, her legs shaky but determined. Then let's go, she said, her voice steady. I'm not going back. The woman grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the door. This is your last chance, she said, her face grave. If you leave now, there's no going back. If they catch us... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Tara knew the consequences would be unimaginable. They stepped into the hallway, the sound of the yacht's engines rumbling beneath them. The fate of everything she'd known, and everything she could become, hung in the balance. But there was no turning back now. They were both in this fight together. And this was only the beginning. Tara's pulse raced as they moved through the dimly lit halls of the yacht, her every step careful, her heart thundering in her chest. The woman beside her moved quickly, silently, her face set in a mask of grim determination. They passed rooms, corridors, all unfamiliar to Tara, as she tried to push the panic creeping into her thoughts to the back of her mind. There was no turning back now. She couldn't go back to the life she had once known, the life that had seemed so perfect on the surface. That woman, that place, everything had been a lie. The truth was ugly, and it had already dug its claws deep into her. But now she was fighting back, fighting for her life. How much farther? Tara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. The woman glanced at her, her expression unreadable. Just a little further, she replied. The antidote's in a safe. In the lower levels. It's well hidden, but it's our only shot. Tara nodded, her thoughts racing. The antidote, there was a chance. A slim chance, but still, a chance to undo everything the Sheik had done to her, to everyone he had manipulated and destroyed. They rounded a corner, and the woman signaled for Tara to stay low. Wait here, she whispered urgently. I'll check the area. Tara crouched against the wall, trying to steady her breath, trying to calm her mind. The weight of what they were about to do settled on her shoulders. One wrong move, and they'd both be dead. The thought twisted in her gut. After what felt like an eternity, the woman returned, her face a mixture of relief and urgency. We need to go. Now. They moved quickly again, the tension palpable, until they reached a heavy metal door at the end of a hallway. The woman motioned to the keypad next to it. This is it. Tara's breath caught as the woman typed in the code, the lock clicking open with a soft, ominous sound. They entered a small, sterile room, and the woman moved to a cabinet along the far wall. Tara's heart skipped when she saw it, the small glass vial, glowing faintly in the dim light. The antidote. The woman grabbed it and turned to Tara, her eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. This is it, she said, her voice quiet but firm. You take this, and the virus inside, you will be neutralized. It's over. Tara's fingers trembled as she took the vial, staring at it in disbelief. Could it really be this simple? After everything she'd been through, could this tiny bottle of liquid really erase it all? The woman's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Tara saw the humanity in her eyes. You're stronger than you think. You've already made it this far. With shaking hands, Tara uncorked the vial. She looked at the woman one last time before lifting it to her lips. To the end, Tara whispered, and with that, she drank. The world seemed to pause as the liquid slid down her throat, cold and bitter. The sensation spread through her body in a slow, uncomfortable wave, but she didn't let herself falter. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was done being a pawn. She had taken control, and now everything would change.